The dust of Iron Bell settled on Clara Haskins, the way grief settles on a person, slowly, completely working its way into every crease and hollow until it becomes indistinguishable from the skin itself. It was a fine red powder, the particular clay dust of the Wyoming high country, and it covered the main street of town each dry morning like a judgment rendered overnight. Clara had grown up in that dust. She had played in it as a child, worked in it as a girl, breathed it every day of her 18 years without once thinking about it. She was thinking about it now. She stood outside the office of Edmund Haskins with a single carpet bag at her feet and her father's felling axe leaning against her leg, and the dust settled on her shoulders and her hair and the worn leather of her boots, and she let it because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, and the dust at least did not require anything of her. Her father, Gideon Haskins, had died 11 months ago. A fever that arrived on a Tuesday and was finished with him by Friday, moving through his body with the efficient indifference of something that had a schedule to keep. He had been 44 years old and had never been sick a day in Clara's memory, which made the speed of it worse, somehow the way a tree that has stood through 100 storms can be taken down by the 101st without warning. He left behind a cold body in a warm ranch that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and the particular grease he used on the hinges of the barn door, a smell so specific and so him that Clara had not been able to open that door for 3 weeks after the funeral without stopping to press her forehead against the wood and breathe. She had kept the ranch running through that first winter alone. She had done it on stubbornness and muscle memory and the deeply internalized knowledge of a girl who had been following her father through fields and forests since she could walk steadily enough to keep up. She had fed the livestock in the dark of January mornings when the temperature dropped low enough to make breathing painful. She had mended the south fence after the February ice storm split 3 posts. She had kept the accounts in the same cracked leather ledger Gideon had kept them in handwriting that was not his but that tried in its careful precision to honor the way he had approached numbers as facts to be respected, not negotiated with. She had done everything right. She had done everything he would have done. It had not mattered. Edmund had arrived in the first week of March coming from Cheyenne in a coat that cost more than Clara's monthly flour supply, riding a horse that had clearly never pulled a plow. He was her father's half-brother, a man she had met perhaps 4 times in her remembered life, a man whose handshake was always slightly too firm, and whose eyes moved around a room in a way that cataloged rather than connected. He came with a brown leather satchel and a practiced expression of sorrow that sat on his face the way a hat sits on a man who is not accustomed to wearing hats. Technically correct, fundamentally wrong. The debts, he said, were considerable. He spread the papers across the kitchen table that Gideon had built with his own hands from pine he had felled, and planed himself papers dense with figures and signatures and official stamps that Clara could read well enough to understand. They were real documents and not well enough to know they were fraudulent. The ranch, Edmund explained, had been leveraged against loans she had not known about. There were liens filed in the county seat. There were obligations to creditors whose names she did not recognize. He spoke throughout in the careful, passive voice of a man who wants to describe damage without accepting any proximity to its cause. Things had been done. Circumstances had developed outcomes, had resulted. The conclusion, he said, releasing a long breath meant to convey reluctance, was that the property would need to transfer to satisfy the outstanding obligations. Clara had asked very quietly to whom. Edmund had studied a point slightly above her left shoulder and said the name Silas Vance. She had known that name her whole life. Everyone in the valley knew it. Silas Vance owned the largest ranch in the county, held the primary contract with the Army Supply Depot at Fort Laramie, controlled the feed store and a significant interest in the assayer's office, and moved through Iron Bell with the easy, unchallenged confidence of a man who had never in his adult life encountered a situation he could not resolve in his own favor. He was not a violent man, not visibly. He did not need to be. Violence is the tool of men who have exhausted their subtler instruments. Vance had many subtler instruments, and he maintained them carefully. Clara had looked at Edmund's papers for a long time. She had looked at the figures and the stamps and the signatures, And then she had looked at Edmund himself, at the way his eyes still would not come down to meet hers, and she had understood something that she did not yet have the full vocabulary for, but that she felt with the certainty of a physical sensation in her chest. She did not weep, she did not raise her voice. She picked up her father's axe from where it leaned against the wall beside the fireplace. She had brought it inside the previous night, for reasons she could not have explained at the time. Some pulled toward the object that most reliably carried his presence, and she walked out of the house that Gideon Haskins had built board by board with his own two hands. She did not look back. Looking back would have undone her, and she could not afford to be undone. Not yet. Not here. The carpet bag she had packed held a blanket roll, two changes of clothes, a small sack of flour, a tin of salt, a paper of needles, a handful of nails taken from the workshop without guilt because they had been paid for with her labor as much as anyone's, and the remaining household money, which amounted to $7 and some coins. She had counted it 3 times on the edge of the bed before leaving the arithmetic of a person hoping that repetition might improve the result. It did not improve the result. She was 18 years old. She had no family she trusted, no trade beyond ranching, no connections in any town large enough to offer honest work to a girl with a felling axe, and no references. She had $7. She had the axe. She had the specific granular knowledge of how to keep animals alive through a Wyoming winter, how to read weather in the color of a morning sky, how to fell a tree so it falls where you want it rather than where it wants to go. These were the assets available to her. She walked into Iron Bell and tried to think about what to do with them. It was the notice on the post outside the land office that stopped her. Tacked at eye level, its lower corner lifting and settling in the dry morning wind. A printed sheet announcing a public auction of seized and abandoned properties scheduled for that same afternoon. Clara read through the list with the concentrated attention of someone who has nothing to lose and therefore no reason to filter out possibilities in advance. Mining claims with prices she could not approach. Town lots she could not afford. A warehouse freight consignment with unclear provenance. And at the very bottom of the page, added in handwriting, noticeably hastier than the printed text, as though the person responsible had done so with some distaste. Blackwood Ridge property, cabin and surrounding land 40 acres. Abandoned. All prior claims forfeit. The men standing near her reacted before she had finished reading. A rancher to her left took a half step backward. 2 others exchanged a look weighted with shared history. A woman across the street drew her child close without appearing to be aware she had done it. Clara had grown up on the story of Cole Darby. Everyone in the county had. Cole Darby, who had called himself Shadow and had operated through the valley for nearly 3 years, rustling cattle, waylaying freight shipments, making himself into a problem that the territorial law could not seem to solve until 5 years ago, when he had been found dead on the porch of a remote cabin on Blackwood Ridge, shot through the chest in what the official report termed a confrontation with a citizens' posse organized and funded by Silas Vance. Nobody had claimed the property afterward. Nobody had been near it. The story that accreted around the place in the years since was the kind of story that small communities build to explain things they prefer not to examine. Bad luck-haunted ground, the spiritual contamination of violent death. The cabin on Blackwood Ridge was a place children were warned away from and adults avoided by mutual unspoken agreement. Clara looked at the notice. She looked at the money in her hand. She looked at the dark line of the ridge in the north distance, its pine-serrated edge cutting against the pale morning sky. She thought about where she would sleep that night, and the night following, in the first weeks of the Wyoming winter that were already organizing themselves in the northern weather. She folded the notice and put it in her coat pocket. The auction was held in the open clearing between the saloon and the livery stable, the flat, dusty space that served as Iron Bell's impromptu civic square whenever the town required a public ritual. Abernathy, the county auctioneer, managed these proceedings with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned to find every transaction equally interesting, which was to say equally uninteresting, and who moved through his list with efficient professional dispatch. Clara took a position at the back of the crowd. Not from timidity, but from calculation. She had arrived early enough to study the room, to understand the rhythm of the bidding, to identify where Silas Vance was standing and who was arranged around him. Vance occupied a position near the front with the instinctive spatial authority of a man accustomed to being the center of any gathering he attended. He was large and broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 50s, with a face that had been good-looking in his youth and had since matured into something more useful, commanding certain the face of a man whose expectations had never gone seriously unmet. Three of his ranch hands stood behind him in an arrangement that was not quite deliberate enough to be threatening and not quite casual enough to be coincidental. Clara kept her hand on the head of her father's axe, where it leaned against her leg. The hickory handle was worn to the dark smoothness of long use, shaped by her father's grip over 20 years, until it carried the memory of his hand in its contours. She knew every inch of it. It was the most reliable thing in her life at that moment, the one thing she understood completely. Abernathy reached the final item on his list. His voice shifted register slightly, the unconscious adjustment of a man acknowledging that the last entry requires a different tone, not quite apologetic, but aware. He announced the Blackwood Ridge property and waited for the response he clearly expected. The silence that answered him was immediate and complete, the silence of a crowd that has already decided collectively and without discussion what it is going to do. He opened the bidding at $5. Nothing. He tried $4. A few people shifted their feet. $3. Vance spoke from the front of the crowd, his voice carrying the easy amplitude of a man performing for an audience he considers his own. "You'd have to pay a man to haul the timber away," he said. "Ground's been wrong up there since Darby bled on it." The laughter that followed was the responsive laughter of people who have been given permission by the most powerful person in the room. It moved through the crowd in a wave, and when it finished, the silence was even more complete than before. Abernathy sighed and looked down at his ledger. $2, he said mostly to himself. Just to clear the books. Somebody give me $2 for land and four walls. Clara's voice surprised her when it came out. It was clear and level, and it carried across the clearing with a precision she had not planned, cutting through the residual murmur of the crowd with the quality of something that had been waiting and was now simply said. $2. The crowd turned. It turned the way a single organism turns every head at once, the unified pivot of collective surprise. Clara stood at the back, straight and still in her worn dress, her chin level, her hand on the axe head, her eyes on Abernathy. The silence lasted the length of 2 full breaths. Then the laughter started. It began with Vance, a short, sharp exhalation, more dismissal than amusement. It spread from him to his men, and from his men outward through the crowd, the way fire travels through grass that has had a dry summer, each person catching from the person beside them until the whole clearing was alive with it. It was not warm laughter. It did not contain anything that wished her well. It was the laughter of a community collectively grateful at some primal level that the foolish thing was being done by someone else. Clara's face burned from her collar to her hairline. She felt the heat of it the way you feel a physical thing, a pressure against the skin. But she did not look away from Abernathy, and her hand on the axe did not tighten, because she had made a decision before she raised it, and the decision included this part: the being laughed at, and she was not going to let it change anything. Abernathy stared at her. He looked at Vance. He looked at the crowd. He found no rescue in either direction. "Going once," he said. His voice had lost its professional energy. "Going twice." The gavel came down on the ledger with the flat, conclusive sound of a door closing on something. "Sold. To the young lady. $2. Clara walked through the corridor of stairs to the front of the crowd. She placed 2 worn dollar bills on Abernathy's ledger, took the deed he signed with the hurried embarrassment of a man who wants to be done with a transaction, and turned toward the edge of the clearing. Vance stepped into her path. He did it the way large men with large authority do such things. Not aggressively, not with any motion that required acknowledgement as threatening, but with the simple, unconscious assumption that he had the right to occupy whatever space he chose, and that others would arrange themselves accordingly. He looked down at her from his full height with an expression balanced between contempt and something she would think about later, something that was working to identify itself. "Enjoy the splinters, girl," he said. His voice was almost pleasant. "Sleep light up there. Old Shadow's ghost has had 5 years to get settled in." Clara looked at him. She gave the look a full moment, long enough for the people near them to feel its quality, long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then she walked around him and out of the clearing, the deed folded in her hand, the axe at her side, the laughter of Iron Bell trailing after her, like weather she was simply walking through. She was nearly to the edge of the clearing when a hand touched her arm, light as a leaf landing. She turned, already braced. But it was the old laundress, Nora Whitfield, who had done washing for half the households in Ironbell for as long as Clara could remember, who moved through the town's margins with the practiced invisibility of the very useful and the very poor, who most people in Ironbell look through rather than at. She was past 60, small and bent, with hands that decades of hot water and harsh soap had left permanently puckered and reddened. She pressed a small cloth-wrapped parcel into Clara's hand without ceremony. It was warm and smelled of dried herbs, something sharp and medicinal and faintly sweet. Clara looked down at it. When she looked up, she found Nora's eyes on her with an intensity that did not match the soft, diminished posture of her body. It was the look of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and has finally identified the right pair of hands to pass it to. Nora spoke quickly in a low voice, the way people say things they have been waiting too long to say, and are not certain they will have the nerve for once the moment is actually upon them. "Cole Darby buried the truth before they shot him," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That ground remembers who's worthy of it." Then she was gone. She moved around the corner of the nearest building with the practiced efficiency of someone who has spent years knowing exactly how to disappear, and Clara was left standing at the edge of the crowd with a warm parcel in one hand and a deed in the other, and words in her ears that felt less like a warning than like a key pressed into her hand for a lock she had not yet found. She stood there for a moment. She looked at the ridge. She started walking. The road north out of Ironbell became a wagon track within a mile, a deer trail within 2, and then above the pine line, simply a matter of reading the land's own logic, the lay of the drainages, the direction of the wind-shaped trees, the sound of Granite Creek that she kept to her left as the elevation rose, and the air thinned and cooled and began to smell of pine resin and the cold that was coming down from the high peaks like a slow tide. She climbed for the better part of the afternoon with the pack pulling at her shoulders and the axe strapped to the outside of her blanket roll, shifting its weight against her back, with each step finding a rhythm. She stopped fighting and simply absorbed. She arrived at dusk. The clearing opened without warning, a ragged circle cut into the dense timber, and in its center the cabin stood in the last flat light of the day. It was worse than she had prepared herself for, and she had tried to prepare herself honestly. The roof had collapsed on the left side, dropping a section of poles and old shingles into the interior at a broken angle. The porch had not fallen so much as it had given up, its boards splaying into the dirt with the resignation of something that had held on long past the point of hope. A door hung from a single leather hinge, turning in the evening wind, with a sound that was not quite a creak and not quite a moan. Boards were missing from the near wall in 3 places, leaving gaps that watched her like dark, empty eyes. The smell reached her before she reached the threshold. Rot and mildew, and beneath both of those, something older and harder to name, the specific sadness of a place that has been abandoned in the middle of its life, not concluded, but simply left. Clara stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it without moving. She let herself feel the full weight of it, the absurdity, the cold, specific fear of being 18 years old on a Wyoming ridge at dusk with winter coming and nothing between her and it but this ruin. She let it arrive completely the way her father had taught her to deal with hard things, not by suppressing them, but by allowing them full entry and then deciding what to do after they had passed through. He had learned this from his own father and his father before that. And Claire had learned it from watching him, from noticing how he was the same man before and after a hard thing, and understanding gradually that this was not hardness, but a different kind of discipline. The feeling passed through. She found the deadfall pine at the clearing's north edge and began to chop firewood. The axe moved the way it always moved in her hands, not with her father's effortless efficiency, which had taken him 20 years to develop, but with competence, with commitment, with the rhythm of someone who has done this enough times that the mechanics have been absorbed into the body and the mind is free. She worked until she had a substantial pile, then built the fire, cooked flour and water on a flat hearthstone, ate without tasting. It wrapped herself in her blanket and lay down with her back against a boulder and the axe within reach. Above her, the sky at this elevation was extraordinary. Not the dim lamp-muted sky of the town, but the full sky. The sky that had not been watered down, a solid wash of cold light from ridge to ridge that made the darkness feel inhabited rather than empty. She lay on her back and looked at it for a long time. She thought about Nora Whitfield's words. She thought about a man who had known he was out of time, who had placed things carefully and deliberately in specific locations, who had chosen where to wait. She thought about what a person buries and why and for whom. She slept. The first week on the ridge was the hardest week of her life, and she had lived through several that had qualified. She woke each morning to cold that arrived before dawn and announced itself immediately to muscles that had not yet forgiven the previous day, to a body making its inventory of needs. Fire, water, food, in the precise sequential order of someone whose margin for error has been reduced to zero. She addressed each need in order every morning before anything else. Then she went to work on the cabin. She approached it the way her father had taught her to approach any large problem, not as a whole which is too large to be useful, but as a sequence of solvable smaller problems arranged by urgency. The roof was the most critical failure, but beyond her alone. A collapsed roof line requires two people, and she had one. The wall she could address. She spent 2 days felling young pine at the clearing's edge and stripping and cutting it into rough planks with the axe and a wedge she found half buried in the dirt near the cabin door. She mixed creek clay with pine resin into a thick paste and worked it into the gaps between the logs with her bare hands, kneeling in the cold mud for hours at a stretch until her fingers were cracked and permanently stained with pitch. She found the spring on the second day, a cold seep from a granite face 60 yards north of the clearing, and built a channel of flat stones to bring it closer. By the end of the first week, the walls held, and the cabin was weather-tight, if by no generous definition welcoming. She had constructed a sleeping platform from lashed pine poles. She had established the daily routines of the fire and the water and the small rituals of keeping a person alive in the high country. She had not gone back to town. She was not going back to town until she had something worth returning for. On the seventh evening, she began to clear the interior properly. The floor was years of accumulated abandonment, dried leaves and animal leavings, and the decomposed remnants of things that had once been useful. She worked with a broom of pine boughs from the door inward, steady strokes section by section, moving the debris toward the hearth. She was in the far corner when the broom snagged. She pulled. The broom held. She looked down and found that the tip of a pine bough had caught on the edge of a board, but not with the spongy, rotten give of old wet wood. This board was solid. The broom had caught because the board's edge was raised. Not much, barely perceptibly, but raised as though the board had been set into the floor rather than nailed into it. She got down on her knees. She cleared the debris with her hands until the board was exposed. It was oak, dense-grained and dark, unmistakably different from the surrounding pine. 18 inches wide, perhaps 4 feet long. She pressed her palm against it and felt the solidity, the absence of rot, spongy give. She ran her fingers around the edges. No nail holes anywhere along the perimeter. The board had not been fastened. It sat in its space by fit and weight alone, placed with the precision of something that was meant to be found under specific circumstances by a specific kind of attention. There was a mark in the near edge. She brought her face close to see it in the failing light. A letter vive cut with a blade, clean-lined and deliberate, the work of someone taking time. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at it. She thought about Nora's words, the speed and weight of them, the look on the old woman's face that she was only now correctly identifying. It had not been pity. It had not been warning. It had been relief. The specific relief of a person who has been waiting too long to transfer something to someone else and has finally found the right hands. She did not open the board that evening. She swept the debris back over it, covering the V mark, and went to bed. Whatever was under that board had waited 5 years. It could wait until she was ready. She was going to be ready on her own terms, at a moment of her own choosing, not in the dark with failing light and uncertain walls. The threshold stone caught her attention the next morning. She had crossed it 20 times without seeing it, because exhaustion directs the eyes forward and downward, and not at the ground directly beneath the feet. But in the particular flat light of a cold October morning, it was unmistakable. It was not granite, not the rough gray stone of the surrounding ridge. It was river slate, dark green, smoothed by water carried from a considerable distance, and placed here deliberately. And on its forward edge, beneath a crust of accumulated dirt that she cleared with her thumbnail, a carved shape, a spiral, its lines following each other inward, with the patience of something made to last. She stood up and looked from the threshold stone back into the cabin, where the oak board lay beneath its covering of swept debris. Two things placed with purpose in a cabin that was otherwise entirely without ornament. She thought about Cole Darby, about the town's story of him, 3 years of raids and disappearances, and a reign of calculated disruption through the valley, and then the final morning on this porch, when Vance's posse had come up the ridge and found him waiting, and the shots and the body that had been left on the porch for a day as a kind of public instruction. She had been 13 when it happened. She remembered the way the adults in Iron Bell had spoken of it afterward. The complex mixture of relief and something else she had not had the vocabulary for at 13. She was developing the vocabulary now. She went back inside and added wood to the fire and thought about a man who had known the posse was coming, who had had time enough to place a particular stone at his doorway and carve a particular symbol into it, who had arranged something beneath his floor with enough care to line it against the damp. She thought about what such a man would choose to preserve, and why and what kind of person he would have been preserving it for. She did not sleep well that night. She was on the porch in the thin, early morning light 6 days after her arrival, splitting kindling, when she heard the horse coming up the south trail. She was behind the cabin before the rider cleared the tree line, her back to the wall, the axe in her hand, her heartbeat audible in her own ears. She had been alone for 6 days and had begun to settle into the rhythms of aloneness in a way that felt, if not comfortable, at least honest. And now someone was here, and she did not know what that meant for any of the things she was carrying. The horse was a bay, calm-eyed and well-kept. The man riding it sat easy in the saddle with the particular relaxation of someone who has spent more time on horseback than off and has made peace with this. He was perhaps 40, weathered in the specific way of men who work outdoors through all 4 Wyoming seasons, with a canvas coat and a practical hat, and hands she could see, even at this distance, were broad and calloused, and had done real work for a long time. He pulled up at the clearing's edge and took in the patched walls and the woodpile in the cleared yard with a look that was neither surprised nor impressed, but simply observational. He saw her when she came around the corner, axe in hand, and tipped his hat without any change in his expression. "Corbett Kincaid," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "My ranch runs west of this property. I've been watching your smoke for 6 days. Wanted you to know there's a hard freeze coming. 3 days out, maybe 4. Clara kept the axe in her hand. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at things that required accurate assessment. "Clara Haskins," she said, "this is my property." He nodded the nod of a man who finds this information unsurprising and unproblematic. He looked at the east wall of the cabin with a slight frown. "That main crossbeam is failing," he said. "Weight of snow on what's left of the roof will take the east wall down." He looked at her steadily without apology. "I have tools and I know how to use them. It would be a poor use of my time to ride back down and let that happen to somebody on a ridge this far from help." She looked at the beam he was referring to. She had known about the beam. She had been hoping the freeze would hold off long enough for her to devise something. "I can't pay you," she said. He shook his head once. "Wouldn't take it." He dismounted and began to unpack his saddlebag, with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has already made his decision and is waiting for the other party to make theirs. She watched him for a moment, then she turned toward the cabin door. "Come look at it," she said. "Tell me what you think we need." They worked 3 days on the beam and the supporting structure. Corbett was a quiet and useful presence, the kind of man who understands that work is its own conversation, and that silence within it is not absence, but focus. He showed her the leverage principle for raising the failing beam, the correct way to notch a support post so it carries load without splitting along the grain. How to read a log wall to distinguish failing wood from wood that still has years in it. He demonstrated each thing once carefully and then stepped back and let her do it, which was exactly the right approach, and told her more about him than any amount of talking would have. On the third day, they needed to clear the entire cabin floor to properly anchor the new posts. They worked from the door inward, moving debris to the outside, exposing the boards section by section. When they reached the far corner, Corbett set down his lantern and crouched beside the oak plank. He ran his hand along the edge, noted the absence of nail holes, found the V-mark with his thumb, and traced it slowly. He looked up at Clara. She was already holding the axe, not as a tool for chopping, as a key. She set the blade into the V-mark, feeling the fit of it, the way the carved notch received the axe's edge, as if the two had been made in relation to each other, which she now understood was exactly what had happened. She applied steady downward pressure, her weight behind the handle, and the plank answered her. It lifted with a long, low groan of wood that had been seated for 5 years and was now being moved for the first time, and then it came free. Corbett held the lantern over the space it revealed. The hollow was lined with oilcloth, neatly folded and pressed into the corners to seal against moisture. Inside the oilcloth, a leather satchel, dark with age, sitting in the space with the patient density of something placed in certainty and left to wait in the same certainty for whoever arrived with the right key. Clara reached into the hollow. The leather was cold and stiff under her fingers. She closed her hands around the straps and lifted. It was heavier than she had expected. She set it on the cabin floor between them. The lantern flame moved in a draft from the newly opened space, and their shadows shifted on the walls, and the ridge outside was absolutely silent, and the evening was still. And from somewhere above the clearing, the hawk that had circled every afternoon since her arrival called once into the darkening sky. Clara's fingers worked the stiff brass buckles. They released with a dry click. She lifted the flap. The smell that rose from the interior was the smell of things preserved against time. Dry paper, aging leather, the faint metallic residue of old ink. She reached inside and withdrew a thick packet of documents bound with a clerk's ribbon. She brought them into the lantern light and read the heading on the first one. Union Pacific Railroad. Bearer bond. The face value printed beneath it was a sum that required her to read it twice. There were perhaps 40 of them. She set them aside and reached in again. A bundle of letters tied with ribbons so faded it had lost its original color and become something between gray and lavender. The handwriting on the outermost envelope was elegant, careful, the penmanship of someone who had been educated to a standard above what their eventual life required of them. She did not open these yet. At the bottom of the satchel, her fingers found something flat and rectangular and rigid. She drew it out. A ledger, small, bound in black leather, the cover worn at the corners. She opened it to the first page. The same elegant handwriting filled the columns, but this was not correspondence. This was accounting. Dates in the left margin, descriptions in the center column, figures in the right, and beside each entry a name. She read the first entry. She read the second. She read the third. Then she turned to the back of the ledger and read the last pages where the entries were most recent and where the names were recorded with the most frequency. Silas Vance's name appeared on 11 of the last 14 pages. She closed the ledger and held it in her hands for a moment without speaking. The lantern light moved. Outside, the wind was picking up, coming now from the north, with the first real cold of the approaching freeze. She looked at Corbett. He had been watching her read with the patient attention of a man who understands that this is not his moment and has no desire to make it so. "We need to go through all of it," she said, carefully. Tonight. He nodded. He added wood to the fire in the hearth without being asked, and they settled in on either side of it, and Clara began at the beginning. The bonds were Union Pacific Railroad securities, each one a bearer instrument, payable to whoever held it, each one carrying a serial number and an issue date, and a face value that multiplied across the full stack represented more money than Clara had ever seen denominated in a single place. They were genuine, the paper, the printing, the railroad seal. She had no way to verify this absolutely, but she had grown up handling documents, and she knew the difference between real paper and counterfeited paper, the way you know the difference between real wood and painted tin. The letters she read carefully in order, and they took a long time. Cole Darby had written to his wife, whose name was Amelia, across a period of approximately 3 years, letters that had apparently never been sent or had been recovered, and kept letters that together constituted a confession and an explanation and a love story and a document of a man's slow losing struggle with a situation he had entered willingly and then found he could not exit. He wrote well. He wrote with the precision of someone who understands that clarity is a form of respect for the person being written to, and the letters were clear. In the beginning, he wrote, Vance had approached him with a proposition. The Valley's economy had been difficult. Vance's enterprises were extended. The proposition was this: Cole would organize raids on Vance's own cattle and freight shipments, raids carefully staged to appear genuine, to generate the federal relief payments and insurance settlements that followed genuine frontier losses. The proceeds would be split. Cole would take the blame as the outlaw. Vance would take the money as the victim. It had seemed, Cole wrote, with the dry self-awareness of a man assessing his own past failures, like the kind of arrangement that only a fool or a desperate man would enter. He had been at that particular moment both. He wrote about trying to exit the arrangement. He wrote about what Vance had said when he raised the subject. He wrote about Amelia, about his fear for her, about the specific leverage that Vance had discovered and used without hesitation. He wrote about building the hiding place in the floor of the Blackwood cabin, writing that he knew, by the time he was writing it, that the end was coming and that Vance would not let him live to testify. He wrote about the ledger he had kept, the meticulous record of every transaction, every name, every sum maintained, with the obsessive care of a man who understood that this record was the only thing that would outlast him and that it had to be sufficient to the task he was leaving it. He wrote, I have put the truth where only the right hands will find it. I do not know whose hands those will be, but I believe the ground keeps faith with people who deserve it. Clara set down the last letter and looked at the fire for a long time. Then she picked up the ledger again and turned to the final pages and found what she had been bracing herself to find since she first identified the pattern of the entries. On page 14 in Cole Darby's careful handwriting was an entry dated 8 months earlier, 8 months before Gideon Haskins had died of a fever that came on fast and left nothing behind. The entry recorded a payment of $400 to Edmund Haskins, described in Cole's coded shorthand that she had learned to read by now. A payment for services rendered in connection with the preparation of land transfer documents. She read it 3 times. Then she set the ledger down on the floor of the cabin that had cost her $2 and everything else she owned, and she looked at the fire, and she felt the things she was feeling move through her completely. The grief that was also rage. The grief that was also the specific shattering of understanding that comes when the story you have been telling yourself about your life turns out to have been missing essential information. Corbett said nothing. He was looking at the fire too. He had been reading over her shoulder for the last hour carefully, quietly, and he knew what was in the ledger, and he was giving her the time the moment required. After a while, she said, My father didn't owe Vance anything. Corbett shook his head slowly. No, he said. He didn't. She picked up the ledger again. Edmund signed the transfer documents, she said. Documents that weren't legitimate. Documents that never should have existed. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people in the presence of a large and serious truth observing it. The storm struck that night. It came from the north with the efficiency of a Wyoming winter that has been gathering itself for weeks and has finally decided to commit a wall of wind first, then snow driving horizontal, then the temperature dropping fast enough that the moisture on the cabin walls crystallized, and the fire in the hearth had to be fed constantly to hold its ground. Clara and Corbett had the stove burning at full draw and had stuffed the remaining gaps in the walls with pine boughs and blankets, and it was still cold enough to see your breath inside, still cold enough that Clara wore her coat to sleep and put on her boots before her feet touched the floor in the morning. The storm kept them on the ridge for 2 days. On the first night, in the middle of the storm's loudest hour, there was a sound at the door. Not the wind. The wind had its own voice by then, a sustained low note, with gusts that spiked and subsided, and Clara had learned its rhythms well enough to hear within it. This sound was different. This was the rhythm of a person's knocking, desperate, irregular, the knocking of someone who is not entirely sure they have the strength to keep doing it. She looked at Corbett. He was already moving toward the door, picking up the heavy chunk of firewood he had set near the hearth. She opened it. A man stood in the snow so covered in white that for a moment he was barely distinguishable from the storm behind him. He was perhaps 35, his face a map of fear and cold, his words coming out in fragments between teeth that were clicking against each other with a regularity that was almost rhythmic. "Please," he managed. "My wife, the baby is coming. Our wagon broke an axle down the south trail. I can't." Clara was already moving past him into the storm. Corbett helped the man bring his wife inside. Her name was Dora Mercer, and she was perhaps 28, and she had been in labor for several hours, and she was exhausted in the particular way of a person who has been afraid at the same time as in pain and has run out of reserve for both. Her daughter, who was perhaps 5 years old, followed them inside, wrapped in her father's coat, her face absolutely silent with the particular terror of a child who has decided that if she makes no sound, perhaps the worst thing will not happen. Clara gave Dora the warmest spot by the fire. She gave the little girl the blanket off her sleeping platform. She opened Nora Whitfield's cloth parcel, which she had kept carried up the mountain stored in her pack, threw everything, and found inside it yarrow and shepherd's purse, and several things she could not identify, but that smelled of the specific competence of someone who knew what they were doing. She brewed what she could identify into a strong tea and gave it to Dora in the tin cup. Then she did what needed to be done. She had never delivered a baby. She had assisted with the births of calves and foals and knew the basic logic of the thing. Knew that the primary requirement was not expertise, but steadiness, the willingness to be present and calm in the presence of something that is happening, whether you are calm or not, and that is helped by calmness. She was steady. She had been practicing steadiness for months now in conditions that had required it without asking her permission. The baby was born before midnight, a boy small but determined, announcing himself into the cold cabin air with the authority of something that has made a very long journey and has opinions about it. Dora Mercer wept and held him and looked at Clara with the specific gratitude of a person who does not yet have words for what they want to say and knows it. Clara covered them both and went to sit by the fire. Corbett was across the hearth, the Mercer husband beside him now with a cup of coffee. Clara had somehow produced both men looking at the fire with the particular male silence of people who have been in the vicinity of something that was not theirs to do and are grateful and a little undone by it. After a while, Corbett looked at Clara across the fire and said nothing. But the look said something. It said, "I see what you are." It said, "I understand now." She looked back at him and then looked at the fire and thought about the ledger pressed against her ribs inside her coat, where she had placed it when the knocking started and where it had stayed through all of it. She thought about Vance, who had sent someone up the ridge. She was sure of this, now sure that the careful footsteps she had heard outside the cabin on her 6th night had been Vance's man checking whether the cabin had been examined, whether anything had been found. She thought about the fact that the storm had kept him from completing whatever task he had been sent to do, and that the storm would not last forever. She had to move first. She had to be in Iron Bell before Vance's man reported back. On the morning of the 2nd day, the storm broke. The sky went from gray to a pale wash blue, and the wind dropped from a roar to a murmur, and the snow sat on every surface in the perfect, undisturbed silence of a world temporarily remade. Corbett found the boot prints before she did. He came back from the woodpile with a look on his face that she had not seen from him before. Not alarmed exactly, but serious in a way that was different from his ordinary seriousness. 3 sets of prints, he said, around the north side of the cabin. They circled twice and came back to the south trail. Sometime in the night before the last big snow, maybe the second night of the storm, he looked at her steadily. Someone came up here. In that weather. They didn't get inside, but they tried. Clara already knew what this meant. The ledger was in her coat. The bonds were in the satchel inside her shirt. She had been sleeping with both for 2 nights and had not entirely known why until now. She looked at Corbett. She looked at the Mercer family. Dora still on the floor platform with the baby, the little girl asleep beside her. Harlan Mercer beside the rebuilt fire, with the look of a man who has been shaken to his foundations and is slowly rebuilding. "I need to go down to town," she said. "Today, before the trail closes again." Corbett looked at her without surprise. He had been reading the same situation. "I'll stay here," he said, "with them, until they're ready to move." She looked at the Mercer family. She looked at Corbett. She looked at the cleared yard and the repaired walls and the rebuilt porch step and the threshold stone with its spiral, which was visible now through the open door, catching the morning light in the way that deliberate things catch light. She picked up her father's axe and went. The descent took 3 hours on snow-packed trail, following her own old prints where they were still visible and reading the terrain where they had been covered. She descended through pine forest and then through the lower timber and then onto the wagon road that led to the valley floor. And as she walked, she organized what she was going to do and how she was going to do it in the precise sequential way that she had learned on the ridge, not as a whole overwhelming structure, but as a series of specific manageable steps. She needed Judge Harlan Morse. She had known this since the second night with the ledger in her hands, had known that local law was not sufficient for what the ledger contained, that Vance's influence ran through Iron Bell's ordinary structures too completely for ordinary channels to be trusted. She needed the circuit judge, a man who traveled his rotation without owing permanent debts to any particular community's power arrangements. Corbett had told her about Morse on his second day at the cabin. She had asked carefully, as though she were only making conversation, and had stored the information in the place where she was storing everything that might prove useful. Judge Morse's circuit rotation brought him to Iron Bell that week. She had counted the days. She was aware she descended of the evidence against her skin. The ledger in her inner coat pocket, the bonds in the flat satchel pressed against her ribs, the bundle of letters against her left side. They were warm from her body heat. She thought about Vance's man on the ridge in the storm and about the network of obligation and intimidation that Vance had built over 20 years in the valley, and she walked faster. She reached the edge of town as the afternoon light began to angle. She felt before she could see clearly the change in the quality of attention that met her at the street's edge. The Mercer family had sent word before the storm closed in. Harlan Mercer had dispatched a neighbor going south on the afternoon of the storm's first day, asking that his family be looked for on the South Ridge Trail. The neighbor had reached town and told what he knew, that there was a woman on the ridge, that the Mercer wagon had broken down in the storm's approach, that someone had gone up to help. By the time the storm broke, some version of the story had moved through Iron Bell in the way that stories move through small, isolated communities, expanding with each telling, gaining the particular emotional weight that accumulates around a tale of shelter given in bad weather. The town that had laughed at Clara Haskins 2 months ago looked at her now with a different species of attention. Not warmth exactly. Something more complicated and more honest, the look of a community that has revised an assessment and is not yet sure what to do with the revision. She walked through it without stopping. She went directly to the hotel, which was where the circuit judge would stay, and she sat down at a table near the window and ordered coffee she could not really afford, and waited. Judge Harlan Morse arrived an hour later. He came in with 2 men who had the bearing of official travel, both watchful and quietly tired. The judge himself was past 60, lean, with the particular deliberateness of movement that belongs to men who have spent decades making consequential decisions and have learned to move at the pace of the decisions rather than the pace of their impulses. His face had settled into an expression of permanent, attentive consideration. It was not a warm face. It was a precise and reliable one. Clara stood up and crossed the dining room and introduced herself before he had fully removed his coat. She stated her name. She stated that she was the legal owner of the Blackwood Ridge property purchased by public auction. She stated that in the course of occupying that property, she had come into possession of materials constituting significant federal evidence, and that she was requesting a formal public hearing before his court at the earliest possible time. The judge looked at her with the expression of a man revising his immediate plans. He was clearly tired from the road. He was clearly expecting to be left alone with his dinner. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Find me a room that will hold the town." The only room that would hold the town was the saloon. The word moved through Iron Bell that evening with the speed that only small-town news achieves, amplified by its own mystery. Everyone knew that the girl from Blackwood Ridge had requested a public hearing and that Judge Morris had agreed to hold one, and nobody knew why, which meant that by nightfall, every theory that the town could generate was in active circulation. Clara watched from the hotel window as the information spread, as lights came on in houses and stayed on. As men move between buildings with the purposeful gait of people who have something to discuss. She watched from that same window one of Vance's ranch hands leave the saloon at something close to a run and head directly north toward the Vance property. She went to bed and slept without difficulty because she had learned on the ridge that sleep is not a reward for having resolved everything, but a requirement for addressing what comes next, and what came next required her to be rested. She was at the saloon at 8:30. Corbett was already there, standing near the entrance with his hat in his hands. He had come down from the ridge the previous afternoon after the storm broke, and the Mercers were stable enough to travel, and he was here now without being summoned, which was exactly the kind of man he was. They looked at each other when she arrived, and nothing needed to be said. The room filled quickly and kept filling. They came in from the cold morning in ones and pairs, and then in clusters, ranchers and merchants and their families, the blacksmith and the livery operator, the women from the boarding house, the man who ran the telegraph office, people who had been at the auction 2 months ago, and people who had only heard about it secondhand. They filled every chair, and then stood along the walls, and then stood in the doorway. And the saloon held all of them in the particular compressed democracy of a public space that belongs to everyone equally because it has never quite belonged to anyone specifically. Silas Vance sat in the front row. He had arrived early, which was itself a statement. A man who arrives early to a proceeding he considers beneath him is a man who is not as certain as he appears. Beside him sat his lawyer, a man named Pritchard, from the county seat, thin and carefully dressed, with the posture of someone perpetually ready to speak. Behind Vance, Edmund Haskins had seated himself at the edge of the group with the body language of a man trying to be simultaneously present and invisible, which is an impossible posture to sustain. Edmund had not looked at Clara when she entered. He was not looking at her now. Judge Morris entered at exactly 9 o'clock, and the room settled immediately the way rooms settle for people who have spent decades earning that authority. He looked at Clara. "Miss Haskins, this is your proceeding. You have the floor." Clara stood up. She had been organizing this in her mind since the storm's second night, working through the sequence of presentation, identifying the order that would carry its own weight without requiring the audience to hold too many unconnected things in memory simultaneously. She knew the shape of what she had. She had lived with it for days. She was ready. She started with the deed. She placed it on the judge's table and stated its provenance clearly. The auction, the date, the amount, the legal transfer witnessed by the county auctioneer. She was establishing before anything else the incontrovertible fact that the Blackwood property was legally hers, that she had been its lawful owner at the moment of any discovery and remained its lawful owner now. This was the foundation. Without it, nothing else she had to present would have legal standing. Pritchard shifted in his chair. He had clearly prepared for this moment. Judge, the deed is not. The judge raised one hand without looking at him. Miss Haskins is speaking. You will have your opportunity. Clara continued. She described the discovery of the oak plank in precise sequential detail. She described the oilcloth lining the leather satchel the moment of opening. She described the contents in the order she had found them. She was not performing, she was reporting with the factual exactness of a person who understands that the facts are sufficient and require no embellishment. Then she placed the contents on the judge's table one by one. The bonds first. She stacked them in a neat pile, their Union Pacific seals facing outward. They made a substantial stack. Then the letters still in their bundle, the faded ribbon still tied. Then the ledger. She placed the ledger last and did not open it. She set it on the table and stepped back. Vance had been motionless through all of this with the deliberate stillness of a man who has decided that stillness is his strongest available posture. But she could see the quality of the stillness. It was not calm, it was control. And control is always more expensive than calm. He spoke before the judge invited him to. His voice was commanding, and he knew it. This is an extraordinary claim from a girl who has been alone on a remote property for 2 months, he said. These materials could have come from anywhere. They could have been found anywhere. We have no chain of custody, no witness to where they were discovered or when. He let this settle for a moment. Furthermore, those bonds are stolen property belonging to the Union Pacific Railroad. They cannot legally belong to anyone who finds them regardless of where they claim to have found them. And anything else in that satchel is subject to federal forfeiture as proceeds of criminal enterprise. She has no legal standing here. He said it with the confidence of a man who has checked the law and found it arranged in his favor, who has spent the preceding night with Pritchard turning the argument to its strongest available shape. It was a good argument. It was the argument she had expected. She waited. She let the silence go on until Pritchard glanced at her and Vance's expression began to work to identify what she was going to do. Then she opened the ledger. She did not read from it aloud. She carried it to the judge's table and opened it before Judge Morse and pointed to the first entry, the second, the third. Her finger moving down the columns steadily dates descriptions, names, figures, with the patience of someone who has had time to learn the document and knows exactly what is in it and where. The judge read. He read without expression, the way a man reads when he has trained himself not to announce his reactions before he has finished having them. But something in the angle of his attention changed as the pages turned to sharpening, a gathering of focus. Clara stepped back. She was watching the judge when the door opened at the back of the saloon. The man who came in was perhaps 50, dressed in city clothes that had been well chosen for a man who travels frequently carrying a leather satchel of his own and moving through the standing crowd with the quiet, purposeful authority of someone who has a specific destination and is not uncertain about what happens when he reaches it. He reached the front of the room and introduced himself to the judge. August Fielding, he said, claims investigator for the Union Pacific Railroad. I have been on the Eastern Wyoming Circuit for 3 weeks pursuing a matter involving stolen bonds. He looked at the stack on the table. I believe those are the bonds I have been pursuing. The particular quality of silence in the room changed. Fielding examined the bonds with methodical efficiency, turning each one to the light, checking the serial numbers against a ledger he produced from his satchel. It took perhaps 6 minutes. When he finished, he addressed the judge in the formal register of an official making a statement for the record. The bonds are genuine, he said. They are part of a shipment reported stolen from the Iron Bell Freight Depot 5 years ago. Their aggregate value is considerable. The Union Pacific Railroad has been actively seeking them since the week of the theft. He paused. He consulted his own ledger. Under the Federal Railroad Recovery Act, he continued any citizen who discovers and preserves stolen railroad assets and related criminal evidence is entitled to a recovery fee of 30% of the total recovered value provided. The discovery takes place on property the citizen legally owns or occupies. He looked at the deed on the judge's table. He looked at the bonds. He looked at the judge. The legal owner of the Blackwood Ridge property purchased by public auction would qualify. The room breathed. Pritchard was on his feet with the prepared speed of a man who has rehearsed this specific moment. The property status is contested, he said, his voice clipped and precise. The deed was issued in irregular circumstances. The cabin sits on land whose federal classification is disputed, and any materials found within the property of a known criminal cannot be authenticated without independent verification. There is no chain of custody. The girl brought these materials down a mountain alone days after claiming to have found them. There is no way to verify they have not been altered or substituted. It was a well-constructed argument. She had known it was coming. She had sat with it through 2 nights of the storm, and she knew what it required her to answer, and she knew she could not answer it alone. She looked toward the back of the room. Nora Whitfield had come in before the hearing began and had taken a position against the far wall. Clara had seen her enter, had watched her find her place, had understood from the quality of her stillness, the deliberate resolved stillness of someone who has made a decision that cost them something and is committed to it, what it had required to walk through that door. She had not acknowledged her, had not signaled to her, because whatever Nora Whitfield chose to do in this room had to be her own choice made freely. Anything else would make it worth less than it needed to be. Nora walked forward now. She moved through the standing crowd, and it parted partly from surprise and partly because there was something in the way she moved, a straightness that had come into her small, bent frame, a quality of intention in each step that made parting feel like the natural response. She walked to the front of the room and stood before Judge Morse, and she said in a voice that was clearer and steadier than anything Clara had ever heard from her, "My name is Amelia Darby. I was married to Cole Darby for 6 years before they killed him. I have been living in this town under a borrowed name for 3 years because I was afraid, and I am not afraid anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. Vance made a sound. It was not a word. It came from somewhere beneath language, from the place in a man where certainty lives, and it was the sound of that certainty beginning to come apart at its foundations. Amelia Darby looked at Silas Vance. She had been looking at him since she walked to the front of the room, and she did not stop. She told them everything. She told it with the exact measured precision of a woman who has carried a truth for years, and has had years, therefore, to understand every detail of it and what each detail means. She told them about the night Vance had come to their cabin in the valley, not the Blackwood cabin, but their first home, the one they had started in 4 years before Cole died. She described the proposition Vance had made, the arrangement he had outlined. Cole would organize raids on Vance's own property, staged to appear genuine, designed to generate the federal relief payments and insurance claims that accrued to victims of frontier violence. The proceeds would be divided. Cole would carry the identity of the outlaw. Vance would collect the money behind the mask of the victim. She told them that Cole had refused at first. She told them what Vance had said to change that. She told them the specific words which she had heard and had never been able to stop hearing. Her voice was level throughout. The evenness of a woman who has wept for a thing until weeping has been exhausted, and what remains is the hard, clean shape of what happened, stripped of everything except the facts. She told them about the ledger. She told them that she had watched Cole make the entries over 3 years, had seen his handwriting every day of their life together, could identify it with the certainty you identify the handwriting of someone you have loved. She told them she had been present for some of the transactions and had heard Cole account for all of them. She could identify every name on every page. She told them about the night Cole died, about waking to the sound of horses on the South Trail, about the voices she recognized among them, about what she saw from the cabin window in the gray pre-dawn, about what Vance had said to Cole on the porch, the last conversation before the shots, which she heard through 16 feet of log wall, and the particular sharpness of terror that makes the ears preternaturally acute. She had run when the shots came. She had not stopped until she was 2 days from Iron Bell. She had come back 3 years later under a borrowed name because the fear of what she knew was marginally smaller than the need to be near the place where her husband had died, and because she had carried the knowledge that the truth was in that cabin, and she had been waiting for someone to find it. Clara had found it. When Amelia finished speaking, there was a long silence. Fielding spoke from beside the judge's table. His voice was the voice of institutional confirmation measured in final. The serial numbers on these bonds, he said, correspond precisely to the freight manifest entries in this ledger. He tapped the open ledger with one finger. The dates match. The cargo descriptions match. The entry sequence is consistent with an original contemporaneous record, not a reconstruction. This is not a forgery. This is a document made at the time of the events it describes. Judge Morse had not moved during Amelia's testimony. He had not written anything. He had listened with the complete full-body attention of a man for whom listening has been the primary professional instrument for 30 years, a man who does not allow himself to begin deciding before a witness has finished. He looked at Vance. Vance was sitting in his chair. He was still physically the same size he had always been. Still broad-shouldered, still occupying the space around him. But the authority had gone out of him, and without it, he was simply a large man in a chair. And the room felt this and adjusted to it in the same collective, wordless way a room adjusts to any change in the weather. Pritchard touched his arm. Vance did not look at him. Edmund in the third row had placed his face in his hands. Judge Morse looked at Vance with the expression of a man who has seen this particular scene many times and has never found it anything other than what it is. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I am placing all of this evidence under the authority of this court pending a full federal investigation. I am issuing a restriction on your travel and on the travel of any person named in that ledger." He looked at Pritchard with the specific, measured regard he reserved for lawyers who had just argued losing positions. "You should counsel your client carefully about what this means." He looked at Edmund, who had not raised his face from his hands. "The name Haskins I see on page 14 will be addressed in the course of the same investigation." Edmund made a sound that was not a word. The judge looked at Clara. "The deed is valid. The discovery occurred on your legally held property. Mr. Fielding will contact you regarding the recovery claim under federal statute." He paused, and something shifted very slightly in the set of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but a movement in that direction. "You are done here, Miss Haskins. I suggest you go home." The saloon did not empty quickly. People came to Clara in ones and pairs as the crowd shifted and rearranged, people who had spent years operating under the gravity of Vance's influence, and who were in this particular morning still recalibrating what the landscape looked like without it. Ranchers whose contracts Vance had controlled. Merchants who had paid the invisible, unacknowledged tax of his favor. Women who had watched their husbands defer to him in ways that cost the family something, and who had never had the language for what it was costing. They came with words and with handshakes and with the particular awkward sincerity of people doing something they are not practiced at, extending respect to someone they had previously failed to extend it to. Clara accepted all of it with the same steady attention she had learned on the ridge, because these people were going to be her community, and a community is built out of exactly this kind of ordinary, difficult, imperfect exchange. Corbett was near the door when she finally made it through the room. He handed her hat to her without comment. He did not say anything about what had happened in the saloon because he had been there, and there was nothing to be said about it that the room had not said more completely than words could. Amelia was outside. She stood in the cold morning air with her arms at her sides and her face tilted slightly upward, breathing deliberately, taking in the specific quality of the air outside a room where something long held has finally been released. She looked, Clara thought, like a woman who has set down a weight she has been carrying so long she had stopped being aware of its dimensions, and who is only now in its absence able to feel the shape of what she has been carrying. Clara stood beside her. They stood together in the cold without speaking, because there is a kind of understanding between people that does not require language, and in fact is diluted by it, and this was one of those moments, and they both seemed to know it. After a while, Amelia said quietly, "He placed that spiral stone himself. He told me once that a spiral means the same thing in every tradition, every place. It means this is where something begins." Clara thought about the stone. The first time she had seen it in the dusk light, the deliberate inward curl of the carved lines, the sense she had carried since of a message left for someone who would know how to read it without being told. She had not known how to read it when she first arrived. She was beginning to understand it now. The weeks that followed had the quality of a landscape after major weather. Everything altered, the familiar made strange by the scale of change, the air different in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss. The federal investigation moved with the methodical momentum of institutional authority that has finally been pointed in the right direction. Fielding contacted Clara twice in the following weeks, establishing the legal dimensions of her claim, walking her through the documentation process with a patience she found genuinely useful. He was a thorough man, and he was doing his job thoroughly. Edmund came to her before the investigators reached him. He came on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November when the hard frost had set in permanently, and his breath fogged in the cold air, riding up to the edge of her clearing and dismounting and standing there with his reins in his hands and his eyes on the ground. He had the look of a man who has rehearsed what he was going to say and has arrived at the moment of saying it and found that the rehearsal was insufficient. She listened to everything he said. He spoke about the money, about the pressure Vance had applied, about the way the thing had seemed smaller and more manageable in the abstract than it turned out to be in the execution. He said he had told himself she would be all right, that she was capable, that she would find her footing. Every sentence was technically true, and every sentence was a way of avoiding the one thing that was actually true, which was that he had known exactly what he was doing and had done it for money, and that the money had been less than her father's life. She listened to all of it. She did not tell him she forgave him because she did not know yet if that was true, and she had made herself a rule about saying things she was not certain of. But she listened and told him she had heard him, and told him that the investigators would come regardless of anything she said, and told him to go home. He went. She stood in the cold clearing after his horse had gone down the south trail, and she felt the specific texture of that particular grief. Not the grief of a stranger's cruelty, which is painful but comprehensible, but the grief of a family member's betrayal, which carries with it the additional weight of every moment you had trusted that person before you knew you shouldn't. She felt it completely and let it move through her without trying to contain it or redirect it, because that was the method she had learned, and the method worked. Then she picked up the axe and went back to the chimney she was rebuilding. Winter settled over Blackwood Ridge with the comprehensive authority of Wyoming winters, which do not negotiate or apologize or leave gaps in their attention. Clara worked through it daily. She had made an arrangement with Corbett for supplies to be brought up every 2 weeks on the days when the trail was passable. Flour, salt, lamp oil, the specific fasteners and hardware she needed for the work she was doing, and she paid for these from the small advance that Fielding had arranged against the recovery claim, which was still being calculated and verified, but whose broad outlines were already clear enough to plan against. She worked on the chimney through November, dismantling the existing structure to its foundation and rebuilding it from the ground up with flat granite she carried from the creek bed in a canvas pack, fitting each stone with the care her father had taught her to bring to permanent things. The mortar was a mixture she developed through 3 failed batches. Too much clay in the first, too much sand in the second, too much ash in the third, and when she had the proportions right, she felt the satisfaction that comes from solving a problem through iteration, through the willingness to fail specifically and learn from the specific failure and try again differently. She worked on the roof through December, waiting for the days when the cold was dry and the wind had dropped below a certain threshold, and the work could be done safely. The new roof line came together board by board, each rafter notched and fitted with the care of construction that is meant to last rather than to merely cover. Through the deep cold of January and February, she worked on the interior of the floor, which she relaid where the boards were beyond salvage and reinforced where they could be kept. The walls, which she chinked and sealed against the drafts, she could locate by moving a candle flame slowly along each surface. The window frames, which she fitted with oiled paper against the glass she had ordered from the county seat, and that Corbett had brought up strapped to his pack horse in a padded crate with the care of a man transporting something irreplaceable. She wrote to Fielding twice during the winter. She received his replies by way of Corbett's supply runs letters in the precise formal language of a man accustomed to official correspondence, telling her that the investigation was proceeding, that the evidence was substantial, that the case against Vance and the others named in the ledger was being built with the methodical care that federal prosecutors brought to cases they intended to win. Vance's trial was scheduled for the following fall in the county seat. The recovery claim was settled in March, on a morning when the snow was beginning to soften, and the first suggestion of the spring thaw was audible in the sound of the creek, which had been muffled by ice for months and was now beginning to reassert itself through the snowpack. Fielding rode up personally to give her the figure which she had been anticipating in its general dimensions, but which in its specific dimensions she read 3 times to make certain she understood it correctly. It was sufficient, more than sufficient. It was sufficient to complete the cabin and the garden and the corral she planned for the south edge of the clearing, and to keep her fed and supplied for several years without dependence on anyone, and to build the small, solid outbuilding she had been designing in her mind since December, the one that would house the tools she was accumulating. Good tools, the kind that lasted, purchased one at a time with the attention her father had brought to such acquisitions. She put the substantial majority of it in a bank account in the county seat opened in her own name, whose terms she read carefully before signing. She kept what she needed accessible. She made no large or hasty decisions. She thought about each choice the way she thought about each stone in the chimney. Where does this fit? What does it carry? What does it connect to? She bought one thing that was not strictly necessary: a whetstone. Flat river granite, the right dimensions found in the creek bed on a February afternoon, and recognized immediately for what it was. She carried it back to the cabin and set it on the porch rail where the evening light would reach it. She had not used it yet. She was not sure she needed to use it yet. But it was there, and the presence of it was the kind of thing she had not expected to matter as much as it did. Spring arrived in the high country with the particular extravagance that follows a hard winter. Everything at once, the snowmelt and the new grass and the wildflowers pushing up through the thin mountain soil with the cheerful stubbornness of things that have been waiting and are now done waiting. The clearing, which had looked bleak and provisional all through the cold months, revealed itself to be something else in the new light. A south-facing shelf of good ground with a reliable spring and 40 acres of mixed timber and enough open space for a proper garden and a corral, and still room for the clearing itself to breathe. The hawk came back. It had been gone since late October, or she had stopped seeing it. The hawk had its own schedule, and she had not always been in the clearing at the right time of day. But on the first genuinely warm morning of April, it was back riding the thermal that rose from the south slope with the unhurried ease of something returning to a place it has always known. It circled the clearing in the long, slow arc she recognized, its shadow moving across the new grass with the pace of a clock hand marking out a different kind of time. She turned the garden ground herself with the mattock she had acquired in a trade at the general store. Good iron, well-balanced, a tool someone had cared for, working the soil along the south-facing slope where the sun held longest and the drainage was cleanest. She broke the mountain soil into workable tilth with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that the relationship between effort and result is not always immediate, but is always eventually honest. She worked in the compost she had been building through the winter in a bin of split pine stakes behind the cabin, turning the soil one section at a time, getting the feel of it, learning what it was willing to do and what it was going to require. The seed she had selected with Amelia in a long conversation in Amelia's small rented room in Iron Bell on a February afternoon. Amelia knew plants in the precise, practical way of a woman who had kept a kitchen garden through difficult years in several different climates, and she had guided Clara through the selection with the authority of that knowledge: what would thrive at this elevation, what would struggle, what wanted a head start indoors, and what could be trusted to go directly in the ground. Clara had listened carefully and planted according to what she had learned and waited with the patience that the ridge had been teaching her since September. Corbett built the corral through April. He came up 3 days in a row with posts and rails cut from his own timber and installed them with the precision of a man for whom a fence that does not stand true is a personal affront. Clara helped with the digging and the leveling and the fitting of the rails, and they worked in the comfortable, productive silence that they had developed through the previous months. The silence of two people who have worked together enough that the work itself has become a form of communication. He left without ceremony when it was done, which was exactly right. Amelia came up to the ridge on the first warm Saturday in May. She came on the gentle gray mare that Corbett had selected for her from a neighbor's string and arranged for her to board at the livery at a rate he had not discussed with Clara, but that Clara understood had been adjusted below market. She came with a basket of provisions and a small paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to contain two good tin cups and a supply of decent coffee and a worn small book that she held carefully and that she set on the porch rail between them without explanation. They sat on the rebuilt porch in the afternoon light and drank coffee and looked at the valley below. Iron Bell was visible from this elevation, the rooftops the thread of smoke from the blacksmith's forge, the glint of sun off the telegraph office window. It looked comprehensible from up here, and proportionate, which was not how it had looked to Clara standing at its edge with $7 and an axe and nowhere to go. They talked through the afternoon in the easy, unhurried way of people who have more time than they need for the conversation and no desire to compress it. Amelia talked about Cole, not the events which they had discussed before, but the person, the specific man he had been before the valley, had found a use for him that suited its needs and not his. She talked about his handwriting, which had always been beautiful, and about the way he had laughed, which was with his whole body and without self-consciousness, and about the garden they had kept in the valley. The first garden, the one before Blackwood, which he had been inordinately proud of in a way that was entirely at odds with his reputation, and that she had found deeply endearing. Clara listened and looked at the garden below the cabin and thought about the seeds Amelia had helped her choose and felt something that was adjacent to continuity, to the sense that some things persist through what appears to end them. The sun moved toward the western peaks, lengthening the shadows of the pines across the clearing. Amelia set down her cup and looked at Clara with the direct, clear attention that she had, that was nothing like the invisible posture she had worn for 3 years in Iron Bell. "What will you make of all this?" she asked. "All of it. The land and the rest." Clara looked at the garden and the chimney and the solid rebuilt roofline and the corral Corbett had built true. She looked at the porch she was sitting on, which she had built level and square and solid enough to last decades with reasonable care. She looked at the axe leaning against the cabin wall where she always kept it within reach but at rest. She looked at Amelia. "I think Cole left this place waiting for someone who would actually build something on it," she said. "I intend to be that person." Amelia was quiet for a moment. The evening was very still. Then she said, "He told me in the last letter, the one I think you found at the bottom of the bundle, he said he didn't know whose hands would find what he'd left. But he said that the right hands would know what to do with it without being told. He said that was the only kind of person he trusted." Clara looked at her hands. They were calloused and permanently stained with pitch and creek clay and the particular dark residue of long work with iron tools. They were her father's hands in the way that hands become the hands of the person who taught you to use them. The hawk came over the clearing in the long, low light of the late afternoon, riding the thermal off the south slope with its characteristic, effortless patience, its shadow preceding it across the new grass. It circled once over the garden, and once over the cabin, and once over the porch, where two women sat drinking coffee in the evening of a Wyoming spring day. Then it tilted its wings and banked east, riding the air out over the valley, growing smaller and smaller against the pale sky until it was a dark point and then nothing. The sky was clear. The light was warm. The clearing held its quiet the way a well-built room holds warmth, not by keeping things out, but by having been built carefully enough that what matters stays in. Clara sat on the porch her hands had made and felt the weight of the evening settle over her. The good ache of the day's work still in her shoulders, the smell of turned earth from the garden, the solid presence of the rebuilt walls behind her, the sound of the creek down the north slope moving with the increased confidence of a waterway that has come through winter and knows what it is. The axe leaned against the cabin wall. The whetstone sat on the porch rail, catching the last of the horizontal light. The chimney she had built stone by stone drew the clean spring air through the hearth she had not needed to light today, because today had been warm enough without it, which was its own quiet statement about where things stood. She had not built a fortress. She had not built a monument. She had not built anything meant to announce itself or to impress anyone with its presence. She had built a home stone by stone and board by board and season by season out of the worst thing that had ever been done to her and the most honest thing her father had ever given her. And the ground that had been waiting through 5 years of silence and absence and the slow accumulation of its own kind of readiness for someone who understood what the spiral on the threshold meant. Not an ending, a beginning. She had arrived. She had stayed. She had built. And in the long spring evening of her first real season on Blackwood Ridge, sitting on the porch her hands had made and looking out over the valley where her story had started in laughter and $2 and the particular cruelty of a crowd that cannot imagine what it is looking at. Clara Haskins understood something that had no clean words, but that she felt in the same place. She felt the axe handle's weight in the morning cold, and the specific satisfaction of a stone fitted exactly right, felt it in the place where the body keeps what it knows to be permanent. That some things you build to last, and that the building is the inheritance, and that the ground in the end remembers.